It's my joy to be with you tonight. And tonight's lecture is really an overflow of time I've spent in the classroom over the last 8 years here at Bethlehem College and Seminary, teaching college students, especially from a class I've gotten to teach quite a lot on Augustine's life and thought. And so in the college, as we try to study the great books in light of the greatest book for the sake of the Great Commission, we really come to insights like what I'm going to share tonight. And rubbing shoulders with one another as we wrestle with the text in front of us is a way of producing those insights. And as I've done that wrestling, especially with Augustine's City of God, I've come to discover, along with the students, helps for reading our own culture today with an eye towards carrying out the Great Commission. And I just want to say, if that kind of thing excites you or you think would excite someone you know, come talk to us. Come talk to us. Katie in the back afterwards, you're welcome to talk to me. What we're doing here is a marvelous thing. I love it. And I would love to have more people involved with our programs here. So with that in mind, let's begin. Jesus and Seneca were likely born the same year. The Gospel of John highlights the Stoic idea of the Logos at the very beginning. And of course, Paul quotes from a Stoic poet when engaging Greek philosophers at the Areopagus in Acts 17. Clearly, New Testament Christians lived in a society tuned in to Stoic philosophy. And if you've read any Seneca or Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus or seen quotes by them on Instagram, you may have probably been struck by the strong resonance between Christianity and Stoicism. Consider this. Epictetus's manual for living reads much like a pagan version of Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, especially when Jesus tells his disciples not to worry about food or clothing, because such worrying won't add 1 hour to their life or make their hair white or black. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, written as an emperor who faced the crucible of war, strikes similar notes to Paul's declaration that in any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. And Seneca, he seems to have the same pithy sayings that Jesus does. Jesus tells his disciples, "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye and do not notice the mote or log that is in your own eye?" Meanwhile, Seneca, halfway across the Roman Empire, tells his friends, "You look at the pimples of others when you yourself are covered with a mass of sores." What should we think? What should we make of these resonances between Christianity and ancient Stoicism? Well, unsurprisingly, we're not the first Christians to be asking that question. Stoicism was one of the most popular philosophies in the Roman Empire. So the early Christian church was no stranger to Stoic philosophy and its appeal. From Paul at the Areopagus to Justin Martyr's first apology, early Christians certainly appreciated, yet ultimately sought to reject and refute Stoicism. If there's any doubt that early Christians learned from and contended with ancient Stoicism, we need only consider the fact that 350 years after Paul spoke at the Areopagus, Augustine is writing his colossal work, The City of God, which he's both engaging and critiquing Stoic thought. However, while appreciation for Stoic philosophy among Christians continued through the Middle Ages and even among Protestant reformers and on to today, Stoic philosophy as a popular philosophy of life largely ended soon after Augustine. Today, though, Seneca is back. Epictetus is dropping truth bombs on Twitter, and Marcus Aurelius although he's been preserved in the military, is having a breakout moment with workout bros. In other words, ancient Stoicism is enjoying a modern renaissance. Contemporary popularizers like Tim Ferriss and Ryan Holiday promise that whatever obstacles you face in life, Stoic virtues like mastering emotions will lead to the happy life. Modern Stoics are selling millions of copies of their books. Podcasters like Joe Rogan are promoting Stoic practices and receiving billions of views. And in this cultural moment of anxiety and uncertainty, Stoicism has something to offer. And what I'll argue tonight is that wise, faithful Christians before us, long before us, have encountered Stoicism and plundered from it what is true to build up the church, while simultaneously offering thoughtful warnings to the flock to prevent them from being misled by Stoic philosophy. So, I'm going to call on the stalwart Christian theologian Augustine to be our guide tonight, especially in dismantling the Stoic idea of suicide as he engages Stoicism in his book, The City of God. Hence the title for tonight's talk, Augustine Against the Neo-Stoics, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Times. As we begin, though, I want to clarify a few things. First, I want to clarify what it means for Augustine to be against. Augustine is against the Stoics not in an absolute sense, but in a fundamental sense. To be absolutely against them would be to reject everything they say, to never acknowledge common ground. Augustine thinks differently. He is concerned with what is most fundamental. So he considers Stoicism from the inside. He adopts their point of view to really understand, and then proceeds to expose Stoicism's internal inconsistencies, its fundamental contradictions. That fundamental contradiction is that Stoicism says their philosophy of life leads to the happy life, yet they recommend leaving this life through suicide if they discover it is too hard. We can, of course, be against things in various ways. We should be against common vices like internet gambling or profanity or illegal drugs, and even more so against the evils of abortion or pornography or child sex changes. Augustine himself had no hesitation about being against the cultural evils of his day, like the debauchery of pagan festivals or the bloodlust sparked by the spectacles of the Roman Colosseums. But when it came to other philosophies, Augustine worked against them in a different way. In fact, he happily adopts and adapts true insights from philosophers like Aristotle and Cicero and the Platonists, while unequivocally rejecting their fundamental errors. Therefore, I think it's appropriate to say that Augustine is unafraid to acknowledge common ground with the Stoics because he knows the fundamental problem with their philosophy of life. Augustine says in his book to Christian pastors on teaching Christianity that, quote, any statements by those who are called philosophers, which happen to be true and consistent with the Christian faith, should not cause alarm, but be claimed for our own use, as it were from owners who have no right to them. You see, Augustine had no doubt about the truth of Christianity, and any truth that Stoicism might have taught was actually properly Christian truth. Christians, therefore, Augustine says, should be like the ancient Israelites who plundered Egyptian gold to build up Yahweh's tabernacle in the wilderness. Just like The Israelites, though, had to melt down that gold before they could repurpose it to decorate God's house. So too Christians today and in all ages must discerningly appropriate the true things unbelievers see about the world. And that's why the critique of those pagan philosophies was so essential to their successful plundering. That's why we here teach studying the great books in light of the greatest book for the Great Commission, right? So, before we can trace how Augustine critiques and plunders Stoic philosophy, I think we need to answer two basic questions. Number one, who are the Stoics and what did they believe? And two, why is Stoicism making a comeback today in America? To answer this first question, let me define Stoicism and then name three ancient and a few modern Stoics. Ancient Stoicism, at its heart, taught that the practice of virtue is sufficient for happiness or the good life. They taught that practicing the classic virtues of wisdom and temperance, justice, and courage equips people to be emotionally resilient and offers them a path to deep fulfillment. For the Stoics, then, philosophy is not merely a set of ideas, but a way of life. And the most influential ancient Stoics, the big three as I like to call them, are the ones I mentioned earlier: Epictetus and Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. They're, of course, the most influential today because we happen to still have their text. That helps, right? And yet, it's unsurprising then that those are the exact works that the Neo-Stoics are quoting, commending, and promoting. So who are these modern Stoics, these Neo-Stoics that I'm talking about? Well, there are a number of them, ranging from authors to more practitioners. I've chosen to focus on a few most notable ones. Tim Ferriss, who's heard of Tim Ferriss? Kind of a serial entrepreneur and author. He says that Stoic philosophy offers, quote, a personal operating system for making the right decisions in life. Ryan Holiday, anybody heard of Ryan Holiday? He is undoubtedly the most prolific Stoic author today. He's even developed an entire brand called the Daily Stoic, promoting Stoicism through his books, blogs, and of course, plenty of snazzy merchandise. And perhaps most notably, the stand-up comedian, martial arts fanatic, and fantastically successful podcaster Joe Rogan commends ancient Stoics like Marcus Aurelius as a model for living in the modern world. There are others, of course, like former Navy SEAL and author of Extreme Ownership, Jocko Willink, who more recently identifies his approach to life with Stoic philosophy. But of course, Jocko is more on that practitioner end. He's more of a doer than a thinker, which fits Epictetus's exhortation, don't explain your philosophy, embody it. For some, then, Stoicism is more of a set of practices that are helpful for navigating modern life. Increasingly, though, I think modern Stoicism is becoming an entire philosophy of life that guides a movement of people in their daily decisions and ultimate beliefs. You could go to Stoic Week that happens annually, for example, and there's a whole lot of people who do. It's been happening for more than a decade now. But of course, we have to ask, and I'm sure you're wondering, why is ancient Stoicism making a comeback today? Why not 100 years ago, 500 years ago? Why today? I think there's three main reasons why there's a comeback today. First, Stoicism offers inner stability in a chaotic and anxious world. You see, Neo-Stoicism is first and foremost focused on overcoming destructive emotions and guiding chaotic desires toward rest. The modern self, we all know, is searching for guides to the desires, and Stoicism offers a promising guide. Stoic philosophy offers a therapy for our desires, a way of finding peace, amidst anxiety and uncertainty. You see, ancient Stoics were all about seeking stability of soul, a goal achieved by cultivating self-control and self-awareness through meditative practices. Of course, not the chanting sort, but rather the practices they commend are focused on evaluating their emotions from a rational perspective. They constantly remind themselves that while they have little power over what happens to them, they do have power over how they respond. Epictetus sums up this idea in his handbook. Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of them. His advice then? Don't expect that events will turn out the way you want, but wish them to happen as they do happen, and you will get on well. To get themselves to that perspective, Stoics offer a number of practices. Let me just give you a taste. In the book Breakfast with Seneca, one of the more companionable of the new Stoic books, they include an appendix with recommended exercises, practices. The author suggests trying the view from above exercise, in which you imagine that you're hovering miles above Earth, looking back down at your small speck of a self and pondering the insignificance of your troubles in the grand scheme of things. Or you could try the contemplation of the sage exercise, in which you imagine that a wise person, say, for example, Socrates, is watching over your actions so that you can behave with appropriate virtue. Or they would commend the contemplation of impermanence exercise, in which you consider all of your possessions and relationships as temporary loans that might be recalled at any moment. Of course, Stoicism is just one among many philosophies and practices that promise help for our anxiety. The reason I think modern Stoicism has been getting so much traction is because Stoicism is a simple, pragmatic, and flexible philosophy, especially in addressing anxiety that so many face. Some have called it a supremely practical philosophy. Others dub Stoicism as a set of practical tools meant for daily use. And this pragmatic philosophy is appealing to the anxious mom just trying to stop worrying about her kids, as much as it's helpful for the Silicon Valley entrepreneur who is worried about making payroll next month. And in reality, Stoicism's exercises do help with even more basic and mundane concerns like, what does my roommate think about me? Or, will my car start on tomorrow's Minnesota winter day? Or am I going to be late for class? Right? Well, all these things, Stoicism's pragmatic approach offers a wide appeal, right? And it's been, I think, particularly attractive to America's hustle culture, which leads us to the second reason I think Stoicism is making a comeback. Stoicism is a philosophy for doers. Its focus is on how to navigate the chaos and troubles of life. So Stoicism, here's the second reason, supplies a philosophical anchor for today's hustle and grind ideology. This Stoic mindset pairs perfectly with the hustle ideology that says the way to win at life is through hard work, challenging yourself daily, never giving up, never giving in, grinding it out until you win. I think this especially appeals, it has appealed to NFL athletes who look to Stoicism to ground and guide their pursuit of excellence in their sport. It also appeals to the fitness world, perhaps especially those heading to a CrossFit gym or a jiu-jitsu studio. I think it also appeals to young men searching for actionable advice that simultaneously offers a map for finding meaning in life and the practical way to get there. I think all of these groups are looking for that kind of actionable advice for personal growth. And Stoicism teaches mental fortitude, self-control, and accepting what is outside your control. Think about quotes like Seneca's, "We suffer more than imagination than in reality. You can imagine that plastered on a CrossFit gym, right? And for folks that like Joe Rogan and his followers, there's this kind of hustle motivation. And they're looking for, behind that, something to ground philosophically this mindset. And so one contemporary Stoic says this about what's grounding about Stoicism. Stoicism, ancient and modern, believes that the only thing that is good in itself is virtue. That sages are happy just because they are virtuous. And you can be happy even on the torture rack. You must be able to say of everything other than virtue that when those things are lost, it's nothing to you. The Stoic sage, you see, achieves happiness by accepting loss or pain or suffering as part of life, and in fact, as the very tools for virtue. This philosophical outlook offers an individual control and motivation. You decide whether you will succeed. You can determine whether you will master your mind and defy the odds, to quote one book. Stoicism offers a philosophical framework for the modern, optimized self. And this Stoic self, it fits perfectly within our modern secular world. And that's, I think, the third reason why Stoicism is really making a comeback. Stoicism is making a comeback as a complement to modern secularism. Stoicism offers a kind of philosophy of life fit for secularism that isn't really interested in fighting religion so much as it is ignoring it. This calm yet confident focus on being your best self, no matter who or what rules the cosmos, may be what's drawing so many people toward the Stoic way of life in our secular age. Modern proponents present it as a strategy for living a meaningful secular existence, as though Stoicism might be swapped out for religion, like oat milk for regular milk. You got a God intolerance? Try Epictetus. This flexible agnosticism is an attractive feature of Stoicism for modern adherents. You can retain the spiritual elements of the philosophy while remaining outside the confines of proper religion. Or you can adopt and adapt it to suit even the most die-hard non-believers, all while maintaining the integrity of its belief system. One author sums up the allure of this best of both worlds quality in his 2015 New York Times essay, quote, "There's something very appealing for me as a non-religious person in the idea of an ecumenical philosophy, one that can share goals and at the least some general attitudes with other major ethical traditions across the world." So I want to think more about this and one specific way that Stoicism complements our modern secular world, and that's with their agnostic view of life after death. As Marcus Aurelius puts it, things are either isolated units, isolated atoms, or they form one inseparable whole. If that whole be God, then all is well. But if aimless chance, at least you need not be aimless too. This agnosticism toward life after death is clear in how they talk about the practice of memento mori. Donald Robertson's book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, begins and ends talking about death. In fact, the specific death of Marcus Aurelius. Of course, neither Marcus or Donald are morbid or dour. Rather, for the Stoics, the idea of remembering you will die, memento mori, is a tool for living well now. In his meditations, Marcus Aurelius wrote that you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. That was a personal reminder for him to continue living a life of virtue now and not to wait. The memento mori principle for the Stoics is praised universally by them as a tool, yet it also opens up the possibility for suicide. Since this is an important aspect of Augustine's critique of Stoicism, I want to try to at least introduce what the Stoics would say about suicide before we get to Augustine's critique, so you have a sense of what Augustine is keen in on within Stoicism. So let me quote a couple of modern Stoics' attempt to explain in an article today why suicide can sometimes be justified, to give you a taste. They say, quote, Epictetus describes how suicide is ethically acceptable, but only under extreme circumstances. He uses a famous analogy with a house fire full of smoke. Don't believe your situation is generally bad, he says. No one can make you do that. Is there smoke in the house? If it's not suffocating, I will stay indoors. If it proves too much, I'll leave. Always remember, the door is open. The choice is up to you, these modern Stoics go on. If you truly think the situation is unbearable, the door is open. But if you stay, you accept the responsibility of doing whatever it takes to live a life worth living. In Book 2 of the Discourses, Epictetus is told that a friend is starving himself to death, a common form of suicide in the ancient times. He rushes to him and offers his support on his path to suicide. But he discovers that the friend is letting himself die for no good reason at all. Tellingly, Epictetus then says, quote, if your decision is justified, look, here we are at your side and ready to help you on your way to death. But if your decision is unreasonable, you ought to change it, end quote. And what counts as unreasonable, these modern Stoics ask. The Stoics, practical philosophers that they are, tell us by example. Zeno, the founder of the school, lets himself die of starvation because he was too old, fragile, and dependent on others to be able to contribute any more to society. Cato the Younger, the archenemy of Julius Caesar, committed suicide in order not to be used as a political pawn by the tyrant. So these modern Stoics conclude in their article. You shouldn't commit suicide so long as you are up to doing what Marcus Aurelius called the job of being a human. Appreciating and creating meaningful relationships, projects to pursue, useful things to contribute to others, and things to learn for yourself. So long as that's true, stay. If, however, the room gets too smoky for you, then you do have the option to walk through the door. So remembering you will die, memento mori, and even choosing to die if that is reasonable, is the Stoic approach to one of the most fearful and uncertain things about life. And for many today, I actually think they find that compelling. It is, to use a very modern term, centering. So what should we Christians think about this Stoic Renaissance today? Well, like Augustine saw, there's a lot of good here to plunder. Simple practices for pursuing virtue, or the aim of seeking stability of soul rather than giving in to anxiety. And Augustine certainly plundered Stoic thought in his own day. Plenty of scholarship on that in Augustinian studies. But Augustine argues that this Stoic view of suicide unravels their whole philosophical system. Stoic justifications of suicide undermines their whole philosophy because it demonstrates that true happiness cannot necessarily be found in this life. So, moving on now to talk about Augustine's engagement with the Stoics in Book 19 of the City of God. His approach there is to undermine Stoic philosophy, not by attacking it from the outside, but by entering into the Stoic philosophical paradigm and expose from within the contradictions and inconsistencies of Stoic thought. He does this by demonstrating the gap between Stoic virtue ethics and their lived reality, specifically the choice some Stoics make to commit suicide. Now, Augustine's critique proceeds in 3 steps. First, he agrees with the Stoics that the goods of life can't make you happy. They would say only virtue can. Second, he demonstrates with a dilemma that even virtue is insufficient for happiness in this life. And then finally, he suggests that true happiness is only found in eternal life. So we're going to follow Augustine inside of Stoic philosophy to see its fundamental flaw. So step 1, virtue is a reliable road to happiness. Augustine builds common ground with the Stoics by agreeing with them that happiness can't be found in external goods. The reason the Stoics think that is because if we can place our happiness in wealth or health or even our homes, we will soon discover how uncertain, how tenuous those external goods are in this life. You've all experienced this, right? Augustine, of course, describes how life can throw many curveballs to us. Well, not that term, but how many unexpected challenges we face in life. And we can imagine his contemporary Stoics nodding their heads because they make the same arguments he does. A storm could send your life's fortune to the bottom of the Mediterranean like it did for Zeno. A disease could sap all your health and strength. A marauding enemy could destroy your home and family, they say. And so they say with Augustine, yes, Augustine, these misfortunes are always possible, so we shouldn't place our hope for happiness in things misfortune can take from us. Augustine builds more common ground with them. He says what's true of the external goods of life is also true of the internal goods. We shouldn't place our hope in our mental capacities, such as our intelligence or learned wisdom. We could go deaf or blind or even mad. Who can be sure, Augustine asked, that even a philosopher will not be such a victim at some time in his life? Augustine's emphasis on the many possible misfortunes and miseries of this life seems at first to underscore the Stoic position that we should treat all these goods as things indifferent, adiaphora, something we can take or leave. They're non-essentials. What is essential, a Stoic would say, is that we learn to pursue virtue in every circumstance. For the Stoics, this idea that the goods of life are things indifferent means they also see the evils that threaten those things as indifferent too. The true thing is virtue. The real thing is stability of soul. Augustine's catalog of potential bodily and mental evils, then, I think, is intended to unsettle the Stoic who believes practicing virtue leads to apatheia, or tranquility of soul. Augustine gives quite a catalog of evils that we experience in this life. And I think the Stoic, who's initially nodding his head, starts to wonder, can virtue really overcome all those evils? The Stoic says, though, we must seek happiness and virtue instead of these goods of life. We agree. Practicing virtue is, for all of us, a way of finding happiness, but for the Stoic, it's the only reliable way to happiness because we can find stability of soul in any circumstance by our virtue. The catalog of misfortunes and miseries, both external and internal, sets up for Augustine's next step. Step 2. Augustine takes the Stoics at their word and considers whether practicing virtue can lead to true happiness. And he's going to suggest that virtue is not enough. It's not sufficient for true happiness. If virtue is the only true good for the Stoic, then true stability of soul requires that the Stoic sage, become imperturbable. Complete happiness, true happiness, must mean we achieve tranquility or peace, despite all the things happening around us. But while Augustine agrees with the Stoics that the cardinal virtues offer a promising path toward happiness, more promising certainly than external goods like food or fame, he argues that these virtues are just as tenuous as any external good. In fact, Augustine says that those virtues cannot achieve true happiness in this life because no true lasting happiness, no lasting peace is possible in this life. Even the practice of the virtues defeats the idea that we can achieve tranquility of soul in this life, because practicing virtue means you have to be at war with vice. Augustine systematically goes through each of the four cardinal virtues to demonstrate that even from a Stoic perspective, every virtue admits the presence and challenge of evil. To say then that virtue is the greatest good means that the greatest good is constant warfare with vice. Fortitude or courage is the clearest example for Augustine, because the virtue of fortitude requires you to bear evil or misfortune with patient endurance. How can that be true happiness? Augustine knows that the Stoic will respond by saying that the true sage knows that those evils or ills are not real ills or misfortunes or evils. That's just how we perceive them. As we've already said, the Stoic sage learns to treat the goods or evils of this life as something indifferent. But Augustine's not so convinced. He exclaims, quote, "It is beyond comprehension how the Stoics can boldly argue that such ills are not really ills, meanwhile allowing that if a philosopher should be tried by them beyond his obligation or duty to bear, he may have no choice but to take the easy way out by committing suicide." End quote. Remember Epictetus's analogy of the smoky house. We can stay in the house this life as long as we can endure it, showing bravery when we do. But if it becomes too much for us, the doorway of suicide is always open. Augustine is building to the pivot point of his argument. Before we get there, though, I think it's worth pausing to appreciate the Stoic view of suicide with greater clarity. Among the Stoic writings we still have today, Seneca perhaps offers the most frequent and articulate case for Stoic suicide. There's a whole collection of Seneca on death, and where he treats that subject frequently in his letters. One letter in particular illustrates this thinking by a story he tells his close friend Lucullus. Seneca shares about a man named Tullius Marcellinus, who came down with a disease. This disease was not incurable, but it was protracted, and it seemed very troublesome to him. Seneca tells us that Marcellinus began to contemplate suicide. Of course, suicide in the ancient Roman world did not have all the taboo that it does today, thanks to Christianity's influence. But still, suicide was a serious decision. So Marcellinus calls his friends around him to give counsel. And as Seneca tells the story, many friends gave different reasons to live or to die. But finally, a Stoic friend steps forward and offers the most inspiring advice, according to Seneca. Here's how Seneca tells it. "My dear Marcellinus," the Stoic friend says, "don't torment yourself as though you were pondering a great matter. Living is not a great matter. All your animals do it. To die honorably, prudently, bravely, now that is great. Consider how long it is now that you've been doing the same things: food, sleep, the act of love. This is a cycle we move through. Instead," this Stoic friend suggests, "Marcellinus can live bravely by choosing death." So he does. And Seneca describes how his death was, quote, "a gentle loss of consciousness," and, quote, "neither difficult nor painful." Seneca concludes by telling his close friend, Lucullus, who's writing this letter to, that this example has, quote, "practical value for the future. Presumably, Seneca means that we should take Marcellinus as an example to accept death, to welcome it, and cheerfully choose it if needed. This story by Seneca is not too unlike the 2016 film Me Before You. In the story, the protagonist, Will Traynor, is a young, wealthy man famous for his YOLO life. You only live once. Yet he is now disabled by a tragic accident. Louisa enters the story as his caretaker and tries to cheer him up by taking him on a series of adventures. Of course, because of the laws of modern film, they fall in love. But in the crucial turning point of the story, Will confesses to a tearful Louisa that he only wants to be the man he once was, not the man he is now. For Will, being unable to move means being unable to live. Therefore, he wants to pursue physician-assisted suicide. Louisa first calls Will selfish for wanting death when they are in love. But, spoiler alert, they reconcile, and she lies by his side as he orchestrates his own death. Both Seneca's letter and Me Before You operate on the same basic assumption, namely that the good life can be found in choosing death. And both seek to empower the individual to determine their own destiny by choosing suicide if that is what will make them happy. Not just for Seneca, but increasingly in our modern culture, suicide is the path to self-liberation. It's the ultimate act of freedom. But it's a lie, says Augustine. It's a lie that hides its evil logic from the light of truth, because truth shows that suicide is no true path to freedom or happiness. Augustine relentlessly exposes this lie from within the Stoic paradigm by showing that their view of suicide reveals an internal inconsistency at the core of their philosophy. And he pulls no punches in dismantling it. Listen to what he says. So stultifying is Stoic pride that, all evidence to the contrary, these men still pretend to find the ultimate good in this life and to hold that they are themselves the source of their own happiness. Their kind of sage, an astonishingly silly sage indeed, may go deaf, dumb, blind, may be crippled, racked with pain, visited with every imaginable affliction, driven at last to take his own life, yet have the colossal impertinence to say that their existence is the happy life. Like I said, he doesn't pull any punches. But what is it that makes them impertinent? Where exactly is the inconsistency? Well, Augustine exposes the contradiction by presenting a dilemma that makes Stoicism untenable as a philosophy of life. You know how a dilemma works, right? You can have a situational dilemma, say, for example, in the movie The Life of Pi, where the protagonist has this terrible choice of staying in the lifeboat with a Bengal tiger and potentially being eaten, or jumping into a shark-infested ocean where he likely will become shark bait. That's a dilemma. True dilemmas present two inescapable options, two horns of the dilemma, you might say, and either horn seems like it's going to hurt you. What Augustine is about to propose is an argumentative dilemma. This is a powerful tool for exposing internal contradictions to a philosophy, because if the dilemma is truly inescapable, if there's really no third option, then it undermines the integrity of that philosophical system. No one wants to believe in a philosophy that has a nasty dilemma at its core, right? So Augustine often wields this philosophical and rhetorical tool in the City of God to illuminate fundamental problems at the center of different pagan philosophies. So what is the Stoics' fundamental problem exactly? Well, we can ask it as a question. How can a Stoic claim that true happiness is only found in this life, yet also recommend that you leave this life by suicide? Augustine goes on and says, happy life indeed, which seeks the aid of death to end it. If such a life is happy, then I say, live it. If it is happy, let the wise man remain in it. But if these ills drive him out of it, in what sense is it happy? Or how can the Stoics say that these are not evils which conquer the virtue of courage and force it not only to yield, but so to rave that it in one breath calls life happy and recommends it to be given up? For who is so blind as not to see that if life were happy, it would not be fled from? And if they say we should flee from it on account of the infirmities that beset it, why then do the Stoics not lower their pride and acknowledge that this life is miserable? Do you see the dilemma? Notice how Augustine presents the two inescapable options, the two horns, as it were. If Stoic philosophy claims that true happiness is achievable only in this life, why would you ever leave this life by choice? Why not persevere so you can reach that state of happiness? If we can gain stability of soul through practicing virtue, which is the only true good, then we can be happy in this life. So why exit from happiness to the uncertainty of death? The other horn of the dilemma is this: if the troubles of life really can reach a point that suicide is warranted, then how could we ever say that this life is truly happy? It is a contradiction to say in one breath that life is happy and we should give it up. The Stoics turn the virtue of courage into a killer when they suggest that to live bravely might mean taking one's own life. So if Stoicism can really deliver on its promise that practicing virtue leads to true happiness, that's really possible in this life. If they really believe that inner peace through stability of soul is where happiness can be found, then suicide should never be an option, right? But since Stoics do allow for suicide, in fact, even the most praised exemplars like Cato and Seneca commit suicide, then, as Augustine is suggesting, there must be something wrong with their program for happiness. So, you might, though, to be fair to the Stoics, you might come to their defense. And you might say, well, but certainly happiness does not require perfect peace and no troubles. Can't we just agree that some happiness from practicing virtue is worth it? But there's the rub. The Stoics would say life offers endless opportunity to advance in virtue. Every challenge or obstacle is an opportunity. The obstacle is the way to virtue. If this is true, if they really believe that, then why would these modern Stoics and the ancient ones they build on throw away that opportunity to grow in virtue and instead choose death, which ends the very possibility for the good life and throws you into the uncertainty of what comes after death? The good life, the highest good, is virtue, but advancing in virtue is only possible in this life. You might then wonder, does Augustine's critique of the ancient Stoics really apply to the Neo-Stoics, the modern Stoics, since many of them don't forefront suicide as much as, say, Seneca or Epictetus do? You don't hear Joe Rogan talking about suicide. I think this is a reasonable question, and I don't want to misrepresent what Seneca says for what our modern Stoic friends might say. However, I think there's two answers to this question you might be asking. First, Augustine's critique is ultimately against the Stoics' idea that happiness is found in this life, full and complete happiness. Stoic justifications or allowance for suicide simply illustrates the incompatibility of defining happiness as ultimately earthly. Therefore, insofar as the Neo-Stoics today defend happiness, complete happiness in this life, I think Augustine's core critique still stands. Second, while some Stoic practices may help fight through depression or even suicidal ideation, as it did for Tim Ferriss, Stoicism does not have the resources for combating a culture of death. On what grounds could a Neo-Stoic deny a modern person's desire for self-liberation through suicide? Even if modern Stoics can recommend ancient Stoic exercises that might help someone's mental stability, they have insufficient resources for combating a culture that justifies suicide based on a person's preferences. On the contrary, Stoic philosophy naturally points to the kind of justifications that Will Traynor gives in Me Before You. I'm done with the trial that this life has given me. I want out. So I think we're forced back to Augustine's dilemma. If the Stoic affirms this life can be truly happy, then he must reject justifications to commit suicide and instead always insist that we should pursue virtue no matter how hard it gets. If the Stoic affirms the other horn, then we must say life can be really miserable and give up on happiness as a real possibility in this life. And for Augustine, this internal contradiction within Stoicism reveals that their philosophy does not have a clear eschatology that can serve as a ground for true hope in suffering. You can grit your teeth through suffering because you think it will make you stronger, make you more virtuous. But if the suffering gets so hard, the Stoic says you might just need to give up. And without a clear hope beyond death, Stoics cannot offer hope for the deepest suffering in life. And this is why Augustine goes to the third step. In that third step, Augustine points to the hope Christians have in the life to come as what the Stoics cannot offer but ultimately want. Eternal life is where true happiness is found. Eternal life, not virtue, is the greatest good. And it is what true virtue is intended to prepare us for. Virtue is not the end, but a means for advancing towards true happiness. So while Marcus Aurelius or Ryan Holiday may be right that the obstacle can be a way to advance in virtue, what they are wrong about is that advances in virtue will lead to happiness, true happiness in this life. Virtue will not ultimately make you happy because virtue is not the greatest good, and ultimate happiness is not possible in this life on this earth. Augustine goes farther and says that although Christians and Stoics both value the good of practicing virtue, there is a fundamental difference in their view of virtue. For the Stoic, the source of virtue is oneself. For the Christian, virtue is a gift from God that's meant to be stewarded. In fact, Augustine emphasizes that while the Stoics and other pagans can have comparative virtue, pagans can be actually courageous, actually temperate, the cardinal virtues only become true or genuine virtues by God's gift of faith, hope, and love. So the cardinal virtues can put the stage on the road to happiness, but no cardinal virtue can realize the end without the theological virtues. Augustine argues then that the Stoic virtue theory is insufficient to secure happiness. He challenges their conclusion that the sage who has perfected the cardinal virtues will be happy despite his external circumstances. Augustine insists that the sage will not be happy because true happiness can only be found in eternal life. But what about this life, you might be wondering? Can a Christian be happy in this life? Augustine zeroes in on the virtue of hope as the means to happiness in this life. He quotes Paul from Romans 8:24. For in this hope we are saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. Christians, Augustine argues, can, quote, by the hope of heaven be made both happy and secure. Our final complete happiness will come in eternal life, but even in this life, there is a happiness and hope we have through the promised salvation secured by Christ. So I want to conclude then by considering what the gospel says to our modern Stoic friends. And I want to also give us as Christians some grounding for our present age of anxiety. Let's allow Augustine to give the first word to our modern Stoic friends. In a sermon on Paul's speech at the Areopagus in Acts 17, Augustine speaks directly to the Stoics of his day. And what he says applies as much now as it did then. Augustine says to them, "You are among those who trust in their own virtue, among those who place their hopes in man. Virtue delights you, and it's a good thing that delights you. I know, you are thirsty for it, but you can't pour yourself a drink of virtue. You're parched. Let me show you the fountain of life. Recognize Christ as the gushing torrent. And if you are thirsty, drink your fill of virtue from him. Take your fill from the fountain. You won't say anymore, my own virtuous mind makes me happy. You won't be among those who, calling themselves wise, have become fools. But you will be among those of whom it is said, Lord, they shall walk in the light of your countenance, and in your name they shall exalt all day long, and in your justice they shall be exalted, since you are the glory of their virtus," meaning virtue or strength. Augustine was reading in Latin. This is good news, Stoic. You can lay your man-made virtue down. Lay down your self-help books and the gurus who wrote them. Lay down your hustle and grind ideology and the podcasters promoting it. Your virtue won't save you. Your virtue cannot ultimately satisfy you. Instead, receive the gift of virtue that comes only from God. Come drink at the fountain of Christ. Hope in God because he is both the way we are saved and the one whom we enjoy when we are saved. So I think for us Christians, considering Stoicism, ancient and modern, highlights at least two things for us. This is where I want to end. First, receive and celebrate the marvelous gift of God's grace. Receiving the grace God gives us in the gospel offers real happiness now and in the life to come. Instead of having to treat the many pleasures of this life as things indifferent or as a temporary loan, we can receive them as a gift designed to draw us back to the gracious giver. The external goods of life are not adiaphora, things indifferent, but foretastes of future complete happiness that we will have and that provide avenues now for happiness, even if it is incomplete. So, yes, learn from Stoic exercises that teach us not to be tossed around every day by anxiety. But don't be deceived that the good things of this life or the evils of this life are not real. Instead, enjoy even the little goods of life, like the desserts we're going to enjoy in a little bit. A real gift that can be received with thanksgiving. And count it all joy, brothers and sisters, when you encounter trials of various kinds, because you know that by the testing of your faith, you will be made perfect and complete. This is God's good design for us. And then second, even more so, rest and hope in the happiness we have in our future homeland. Is this not the hope we must constantly remember? Is it not what we sing about, not just on Resurrection Sunday? The resurrection is real. We just celebrated Easter. We're reminded then what is true every day. Christ has risen from the dead. Death is defeated. Christ will return, and on that day, we will rise again with him. And those who have by grace turned to him will join him in everlasting life where true happiness is found. Friends, this is our hope in life and in death. And one song that captures that really well by that same title, Christ our hope in life and death, is where I want to end. Allow me to conclude by reading the last verse of the Getty's song that goes like this. Until the grave, what shall we sing? Christ, he lives. Christ, he lives. And what reward will heaven bring? Everlasting life with him. There we will rise to meet the Lord. Then sin and death will be destroyed, and we will feast in endless joy when Christ is ours forevermore. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to entertain any questions you have for a little while now until someone cuts me off or you run out of questions. But yeah, let me know what questions you have from the lecture. Yes, would you just say your name? Ian.
Stoicism is fluent and actually the mainstream in today's culture. And it's my impression that one of the reasons why Stoicism has after does to you, as it is like somewhat countercultural to our more hedonistic, self-centered, the Disney movie Fall Apart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So do you think that countercultural aspect was different from how Augustine faced the Stoics of his day, or was it always sort of against the majority view of self-pleasing, or not?
Yeah, great question, Ian. I'm going to repeat it here so everyone can hear it. I'm understanding your question to be, isn't Stoicism a bit countercultural to the maybe more hedonistic approach in the bad sense, to follow your heart, get as much pleasure as you can, YOLO kind of approach? And what was it like maybe in Augustine's day? That kind of question. Yeah. So first of all, there were really two main philosophies that were most popular in the ancient Roman world, kind of everyday philosophies that most people were buying into: Epicureanism and Stoicism. Those were the two big philosophies. And of course, Epicureanism, as my students know, right, teaches that you find happiness in pleasure. Now, as my philosopher colleagues often remind us, there is a caricature of Epicureanism of the ancient variety that's, they just wanted immediate pleasure. Actually, I mean, the best Epicureans wanted lasting pleasure. But still, that's where they thought you could find happiness, was in the pleasures of this life. And the Stoics would offer something different. But you're right, like today, there's people who think that way as well, right? You could say there's a version of hedonism, maybe not specifically Epicureanism, that's prevalent today. And Stoicism, yes, is a bit countercultural to that. It's saying, no, that's not in fact where you find happiness. It's in virtue. So when I suggest that it's prevalent today, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's like the most mainstream. I think it is a bit countercultural still. but it's mainstream enough that a lot of people are paying attention, even buying into it, which is why I think it needs some attention from us as Christians. And because of its similarity to so much of kind of Christian practices and counsel, I think we have to be very aware of where it overlaps in good ways and where it's fundamentally wrong. Did that answer your question? Yeah, good question. Other questions? Yeah, Mason.
I think I isolate two ills, 2 poisons that are peculiar to the modern age. There's a self-satisfied cynicism, which it's not just the cynicism, it's the self-satisfaction of it.
Mm-hmm.
The sneering of a document as the all figured out thing.
Mm-hmm.
Despises Christianity, but by the way, support for Christian. There's also this unyielding American pragmatism, British American pragmatism, the evolved system of thought culture. And I think of Joe Rogan. There's a sort of a chill, detached. He's into this stuff because it works. He's kind of figuring stuff out. I think of really the spirit of Jocko Willing, who people like him because he's strong. Because he can give you advice to get through the day well. Strong, like Jocko. How do you see Augustine speaking to this peculiar, self-satisfied, pragmatic cynicism? Pragmatism.
Yeah. So Mason's question, two different maybe beliefs: cynicism, pragmatism. You can see maybe both of those in some of the names I mentioned today. How would Augustine respond to that? I mean, I think our American pragmatism is exactly that, American. It's unique to us. So I want to be careful not to make our questions Augustine's questions when they aren't necessarily his. So maybe I'll say more of what I would say, but of course knowing that I'm pretty influenced by Augustine. I think, so I definitely would say, first thing that comes to mind with what Augustine would say is the biggest danger for any person is pride, right? That's going to be true of the pragmatist. I can figure it out, right? Give me the right set of tools, I can get it done. I can be strong like Jocko, and you just got to show me the way and I can do it. That's ultimately trusting in yourself. And I think his point, even in the City of God, in pointing out all the things that go wrong in life, is to show, like, can you really trust yourself? Is that really going to be the best way forward? And so I think he gives them the alternative, which is humility. God gives grace to the humble, right? I mean, he quotes that verse all the time. The way of humility is perhaps the thing most frequently on his lips in preaching, week in and week out. And so I think the response to the cynic and the pragmatist is an invitation to humility. And that invitation is given by a humble Christ, right? Who has shown us the way. The way is not to summit the mountain yourself, but descend to the dead in order that God might raise you up again. And I think the pragmatist, as much as the cynic, needs to hear that. And that's what Christianity, the gospel, has to offer. Any follow-up on that?
I'd be interested in just hearing a bit more what the humility played with them.
Yeah. So, I mean, they're not, I think to say that you need to practice virtue is itself a humble thing to admit, right? I need to actually grow in these things. I don't have everything I need. I need help. To submit yourself to a Stoic sage is a humbling thing. So they wouldn't be necessarily opposed to humility outright. Um, but Augustine, I think, would zero in on the fact that you're trusting ultimately in yourself, um, your own ability to follow through on that philosophy, your own ability to practice virtue in a way that would satisfy and fulfill you. Yes. Yeah. Most of what I was doing tonight, yes, is from the City of God. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, it's a great question. So, Bessie's question is, what's kind of the historical context for Augustine writing this, and the City of God, since it's uh, inspired, is precipitated by this cataclysmic event, namely the sack of Rome in 410. Do the Stoics at that time provide an answer for that more empire-wide, whole society problem that comes from that kind of cataclysmic event? So first of all, I don't know we know what the Stoics said then, because we don't have any collected writings after really Marcus Aurelius, who's in the 2nd century BC. He's kind of the last Stoic that we really have a good chunk of their writing. So I'm not sure if I don't think we have a kind of sense for what the Stoics would have said then. And Augustine, even, he's interacting with specific people, some of whom the only writings we have is what Augustine references in City of God, like Varro, for example, who's a philosopher that he's interacting with. But I think, I mean, as I've suggested, Stoic philosophy is much more focused on the practical ways to get through the difficulties of life. It is more of a practitioner's philosophy. I hope I've suggested that it doesn't really have a very robust metaphysic, doesn't have a good eschatology, and so I think would struggle to make sense of a cataclysmic event like that beyond the individual. And yet, one of the main things, I didn't highlight this, but one of the main things they're going to say is Stoics, they commend to live according to nature, right? And they even give nature a kind of quality of fate or destiny. So living according, like it's fated that the barbarians would sack Rome, and so you need to live according to that event, given your circumstance, given your place in life. And if you're the emperor, well, that's going to look different. If you're a private citizen, that will look different. If you're in Rome, if you're in Africa, it's maybe going to look different. Yeah, good question. Yeah, Graham.
As to the Stoic start self-mastery and
Mm-hmm.
not being perturbable, does Augustine is he more critical of that? Does he take more of that, under more of that? How does he view the emotions and such in the Christian?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, what does Augustine think about the Stoic ideal of imperturbability, this kind of tranquility of soul? Does he adopt that in any way. Augustine's one of those thinkers who changes quite a bit during his lifetime. He is famous for writing a book near the end of his life called Revisions, where he revises everything he wrote and says what he got wrong and what he would have said differently, right? So he's very aware, he's self-aware of how he changes. One of the ways he changes is actually on this question of imperturbability. The young Augustine, soon after his conversion, writing these Socratic-like dialogues between him and his students, or between him and even his own soul, is actually, in there, he's quite explicit that he is aiming towards imperturbability. He is aiming towards, in this life, kind of reaching a kind of tranquility. But then he explicitly changes that later on, and recognizes, actually, most scholarship can say, because of his reading of the Apostle Paul, he changes his mind about that. Maybe especially because of Romans 7, and how he thinks Paul is speaking of himself as a Christian in Romans 7. Eventually, Augustine thinks that. So he does think that that is achievable, but only in the life to come. There will be no person at perfect peace in this life, right? Who is imperturbable, untroubled by the trials of this life. Yes, in the back. What's your name? Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, good question. The question is, do the Stoics today lean towards a kind of spirituality in any way? So as I was saying earlier, the ancient Stoics certainly had more of a sense of the divine. I mean, Seneca talks quite a lot about the divine, about God. He's perhaps among the Stoics most explicit about that. The Neo-Stoics, I would say, downplay that. And they also downplay the idea of kind of living according to nature, as if nature were this divine being that we could learn from and follow, because of course in our modern scientific world that idea just doesn't work. And so I think modern Stoics are willing to take kind of the core practices and the core idea of seeking virtue as its own good, and they kind of let fall to the wayside some of those other things about nature or spirituality. However, as I think, one of the quotes I read from a modern Stoic, they see that, in fact, as a plus, as a good thing, because you can get the best of both worlds. You could be religious and be Stoic, as much as you could be, a hardened atheist or unbeliever. And so I'd say they emphasize more of the practical nature of Stoicism today, rather than maybe its more spiritual elements. Yeah, great question. Yes, Pastor John.
It's man-centered because it's happiness-centered.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of asking you a question, it's so obvious you know the answer. I'm going to make the statement. So the critique is he made happiness and the quest for my happiness, Augustine's happiness, Stoic happiness, the criterion by which he would prove them wrong.
Mm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The only place you're going to find happiness is in the life to come. Finally, got one more, I got happiness. And you gave a beautiful sentence that solves the problem implicitly. It says is Christ is the way we were saved, and the one we enjoy when we're saved. Exactly right. There's one more conclusion to after all. Why is that God-centered? Why is that magnifying to
Mm-hmm.
Christ?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the answer is Christian hedonism. Christ is most glorified in Augustine, and he's most satisfied in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That is absolutely crucial to your lecture, in my judgment. It's man-centered without Christian hedonism.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the question. I got to go to an Acts 29 conference next Tuesday.
Okay.
And they're going to interview me, and they send me a question. And the first question is, how do you engage with the culture? And this is super helpful. I mean, to get me clear on Christian hedonism and how universally useful it is. So here's my question. The question is, does he do this all the time? Is this the standard apologetic of Augustine? Namely, your view will not gain happiness. Is that what he does all the time? Or is that just for the Stoics?
So Pastor John's question is, first of all, you should have said more about Christian hedonism. Thank you. And then, if it's true that our happiness, which is found in God, which glorifies God, if that's true, does Augustine approach other philosophies by asking the question, does this make you happy? Is his cultural engagement centered around that? I would say often, especially in the city of God. However, I mean, with other philosophies, maybe especially the Platonists, he's going to share more in common with them beyond the Stoics. So most of the philosophies he's interacting with are going to agree that what we're after in life, what we really want, is eudaimonia. This kind of, it's a better word than our word happiness today, because it has this deeper, more stable sense to it. Happiness, as we maybe use it culturally, is more fleeting. So he's going to, I think, with those schools of thought, especially appeal to this idea of, well, you agree with me that what we really want is happiness. So yeah, I mean, a lot of texts are coming to mind in Augustine. Book 10 of Confessions. He's asking basically himself as now a Christian, how am I, to come to really be happy in this life? And he's going to define happiness as joy in the truth there. And of course, truth is God himself, right? So he's going to push in ways like that. So if you think happiness is what we should pursue, where do you find that? So yes, he uses that critique a lot. I think maybe to say some of the more common things he does, like I suggested, he does very often try to build that common ground before critiquing them. He does try to show, like, look, here is the overlap, but here's that fundamental difference, that fundamental error that I think your philosophy is making. Of course, that's not always true. In the city of God, he is unafraid to just downright make fun of pagan idols. Like, you guys have a hinge god. You guys have a god for itches. You guys have, like, this is just silliness, right? So he's not afraid to just go at them and excoriate them for their silliness. But I think when he's really engaging careful thinkers, especially those who are maybe most influential, he's going to say, okay, here's what we have in common. And often that is, we do want happiness. We know we do, but your way is not reliable. Here's why it's wrong. Yeah. Okay, I'm being told we got one more question. Time for one more question, if there's one. Let me say one other thought to Graham's question that I thought of, what does Augustine think about maybe the passions? You can read a really great section in book 16 of the City of God where he talks about Christ and his emotions, Christ and the passions that he has. And that's where he looks to as a model for how our passions should behave, what we should be pursuing. And I think he very much has a sense in which our emotions can mature, should mature, and look more and more like Christ. Maybe that's a good place to end. I'll talk to you afterwards. Thank you guys so much for coming.